Recently, on a client project, I really wanted Figma to let me nest conditionals when prototyping. Unfortunately, that's not currently possible. So I found two workarounds that I can show you. Here's the example from that project. I was designing a step completion component, which was a series of steps that are always completed one after another, like this. And here's a simplified version, just to show you the functionality. So when I click on the last step, I want all previous steps to become selected. When I click on this step again, I want to unselect it, but for all of the previous steps to stay selected. If I click on the first step, I unselect all others, and another click on the first step unselects the first step. I think you get how it works just by looking at this interaction. So when I imagine the code that I would like to be able to set up, it would look a little bit like this. This is all happening when someone clicks on step 1. So first, I need to know whether step 1 is currently selected. Then I want to know, is the second step also selected? Because if it is, then I want to unselect it. And if it's not, then that means step 1 was the only selected step. So we deselect step 1. And if step 1 wasn't selected, then we know that a click means it's time to select it. So that's how I imagine this logic. But this exact setup is not possible in Figma. So here are two ways that I found to make it work. First, we remove the nested conditionals from inside of the outer conditional, then we split them into two separate conditionals. We turn the else statement into an explicit check for the case where step 2 is not currently selected. So now, instead of doing the nesting, we do a simultaneous check on the things that we were checking in the inner and outer conditional, and we do it in a single move by taking the check from here and adding it to both of these lines, essentially making sure that we check two things at the same time. Then we still have to make it explicit that we're checking for the case where step 1 is not currently selected, so we pull it out into a separate conditional. And now we can discard the outer conditional and clean this up a little bit. So that's method 1. Method 2 is a little different, but it achieves exactly the same result. So let's back up a little to where we pulled out the inner conditional and split it into two. Again, we replace the else statement with an explicit conditional here. And then inside our original conditional, we want to create a trigger to run the other conditionals. We do that with a variable, which we will set to true when we want to run those other conditionals. So it's a little bit as if they're nested, even though they're really not. We add this to the end of these phrases to make sure they run only when we've requested that particular check. And lastly, we need to make sure that we reset the check so it doesn't trigger when we don't want it to. And that's really it. Both of these methods are kind of similar and give you basically the same result. So why pick one over the other? I think the real annoyance with this sort of thing is if you have to have a more complex prototype with more steps, you have to make sure that for each step you check all of the subsequent steps to know what it is that you want to do on each click. With method 1, you will end up with really long lines that are hard to scan. With method 2, you have a different layout to your code. You will have lots of conditionals, but either way, you will be managing quite a lot of state complexity. So I don't think either of these methods is necessarily better or worse. I think it's really just a matter of preference, depending on what you find easier to think about or easier to understand or easier to make work in Figma. I would love to know if there's a way to make this in a much more straightforward fashion, but this is how I managed to get it done. Thank you for watching. Bye!